Welcome. This is the webinar series, It's Not Just Chores, a Daily Living Skills webinar series. This is a second part to the webinar series, It's Not Just Chores. In the first part of this series, we went over how to motivate and team with your team to collaborate and make this a real team effort. And we also went over goal attainment scaling. This is the second part in this series. And I am Lindsay Rentschler. I have a master's in teaching and I am a board certified behavior analyst. I currently am a doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Applied Developmental Science and Special Education Department. I will be co-presenting today's webinar with my colleague Kiera Peak, who is an occupational therapist and also a doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy Department within the School of Allied Health. Today's webinar is brought to you through a partnership between the Autism Society of North Carolina and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At times I might refer to the Autism Society of North Carolina as ASNC for brevity's sake. So just know Autism Society of North Carolina is ASNC, A-S-N-C. And we are pleased to announce that this is brought to you in part by funding by the Carolina Center for Public Service. So to go along with today's webinar, we have one supplementary material for you. We've titled it the Task Analysis Document. Within it, it has task analysis tips, examples and templates, and a prompting hierarchy, as well as some information on prompting. So this supplementary material can be printed from the website, or you may contact your autism resource specialist through ASNC by calling 1-800-442-2762 or visiting their website, www.autismsociety-nc.org. You will be connected with your regional autism resource specialist, and they can help you get some pre-printed materials. So we hope that this supplementary material proves helpful for you, but as is always the case with our webinars, use what works for you and your family, and there's no need to get fancy with anything. Whiteboards and kind of materials that you have at home can help as well. We were just hoping to give you some items that you could use as fillable documents and examples for you to have and hold. So the agenda for today is to talk about some teaching strategies as a part of the It's Not Just Chores series. Today, we're talking about some evidence-based practices for learners with autism spectrum disorder. Now, if you tuned in for our very first module within this series, the one that I referred to a moment ago about teaming with your teen, collaborating with them in goal setting, then you know that when we talk about teens, what we really mean is middle schoolers through high schoolers, that age group of probably 10 or 11 through maybe 18. This age group is what we're focusing on to start the conversation and the skill building of daily living skills that will help launch them into their young adulthood to have some independent living skills. So I will probably use the word teen or learner a lot, but what I'm really referring to is your child, who is probably between the ages of 10 and 18, somewhere in the middle school to high school range. So we're going to talk about the practices that research has shown to be evidence-based for teaching some of these skills to your teen. And so the research shows us that there are a lot of different strategies that can be effective for this group. As you can see from this page, we've got modeling and video modeling, social narratives, visual schedules, some peer-mediated instruction. There's lots of different things. The two strategies that we're going to really hone in on and focus on today are task analysis and prompting. Those two really go hand in hand, so we thought it would be a good idea to present them together. So in order to really bring this topic to life, we thought it would be helpful for us to relate it to a couple of teens. So here we'd like you to meet Tyler. Tyler is 14 years old. He has a diagnosis of autism without intellectual disability. He loves writing. He likes to write realistic stories and fantastical stories. He is on grade level. His instructional targets currently would be personal care since he's hit puberty. Things like applying deodorant and showering regularly, things of that nature, and maybe beginning to learn how to shave. For him, motor planning and sensory regulation both happen to be really solid, but motivation and emotion regulation require some support, particularly when he's asked to complete a less preferred task. So those are some areas that Tyler could use some supports in. Now I'd like you to meet Jace. Jace is 17. He loves bridges, and we'll tuck your ear off about that. Also a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder without intellectual disability. So we're talking about another learner with high functioning autism spectrum disorder. He has instructional targets around independence around the house. He's learning daily living skills in the kitchen and taking care of his own room and his own things and laundry, things of that nature. His motivation and emotion regulation are pretty solid. He's a pretty even-keeled guy, but he requires some support around motor planning and sensory regulation. He has what occupational therapists might refer to as low arousal, and his fine motor, things like grip, and tasks that require dexterity in the fingers, all of those types of activities are going to require a little bit more thought and prompting and consideration when planning for his instructional needs. So now that we know Tyler and Jace a little bit, let's start talking about task analysis. What is task analysis? It's a good first question. Task analysis is a strategy for taking a task that has multiple steps and breaking it down into its component parts. So this could be very singular, very definitive tasks, things like taking clothes and putting them into a washing machine. Not the entire task of doing laundry, quote unquote, but just the task of moving clothes from a hamper to a washing machine, or putting toothpaste onto a toothbrush. Something like that would be, you could write a task analysis for either of those singular tasks. But it could also include, you could write a task analysis for chained tasks. And so chained tasks would include a whole bunch of singular tasks that need to happen in a specific order to accomplish a goal. So this could include following a morning routine where you need to wake up at an alarm clock, then you need to make your bed, put your dirty pajamas in the laundry hamper, take a shower, brush your teeth, apply deodorant, find your other clothes, put those on, hang up your towel. You can see that there could be many, many, many steps in a morning routine. And so that could be one task analysis as well that chains all of these tasks together. So who would use a task analysis? Instructors usually use task analysis to guide the teaching and to monitor progress of tasks that we want somebody to learn. However, they can also be, a task analysis can also be repurposed or adapted to be an instruction list, kind of like a written visual schedule for a learner so that they can monitor their own progress. So it could be used in these two different ways. Why should we use a task analysis? This is an interesting question. You know, we can use a task analysis to make sure that we are teaching all of the necessary steps. When a complex task is broken down and monitored by each individual step, we can identify the parts of the task that are tricky and causing the goal of the entire task not to be met. So we can isolate the steps that need additional supports or additional teaching strategies, or that they just keep forgetting, or whatever the roadblock is. It's easier to identify when we write everything out. A good example of this comes from one of our autism resource specialists at ASNC, whose own son had learned how to do laundry at school. He had gone away to school, and mom had taught him how to do laundry so that he could do his own laundry. And he had learned all the steps. He put the quarters in the machines and did his wash and did his dry and took everything out and folded it and put it back away in his room. And mom came to visit and walked in, and it was a little smelly in the room. And she couldn't figure out why at first. And then it became apparent that a key checking step in the process of doing laundry was never taught to her son. And that step was ensuring that things coming out of the dryer were actually all the way dry. He hadn't learned that he needed to check for that, and there's a possibility that he would need to put in more quarters and run it through another time if things weren't dry. So he was folding and putting away damp laundry, and in his room, things were becoming a little ripe, a little mildewy, and mom noticed right away that something was amiss. So he needed to learn another step for that task. So it's really good idea to think about all of the steps that a task requires and write them all down and test them. So let's talk about that. How do I write a task analysis? There's a lot of different methods that instructors have used to write task analyses. These include watching a competent person perform the task while you yourself write them down. Another option would be to ask experts or professionals to validate the steps of a required task. You yourself could perform the task and write down the steps as you do them, which is probably the easiest way to do it. And also it can lead you to a greater understanding of all of the steps involved. So that's one that I highly recommend. You can also just write them from memory without trying it out. And that's kind of the trial and error way of doing it. But in my experience, when we don't actually go through the steps and we just try and remember them in our mind, we tend to skip things and leave them out. So that would probably be my personal last choice. But another piece that we might want to bring up here, another thing to remember, is that you can collaborate with your team to write the task analyses. So if your team is really on board to be doing all this, you did all the work that we talked about in Module 1, and your team has made choices about what they want to work on, and they're committed to practicing, they should be involved in the writing of a task analysis as well. So one way to do that would be you are the person who performs the task while they write down the steps. And that could be a really good way to collaborate and get buy-in from the beginning on, how to do the task and why you're doing it that way. You guys can talk about it while you're doing it and while your team is writing down the steps. So let's look at some examples. Do you remember Jace? I know that was a few slides ago now, but Jace was our second learner that we profiled. He is our 17-year-old who loves bridges and who requires a little bit of support around motor planning and fine motor tasks. So this sandwich making task analysis was written with Jace in mind. As you can see, there's 28 steps here for writing a task analysis. And let me just back up for a second and also mention to you that this example of a task analysis, as well as the next one we're about to look at, and some other ones, some other examples, are all available to you in the supplementary materials that accompany this webinar module. So if you can't really read this because it's so small, don't worry, you can read it in the supplementary material. And we wanted to go ahead and show you the whole thing on one page so that you could just kind of get that sense of how many steps it really takes to make a turkey sandwich, especially for somebody who maybe has some fine motor or motor planning needs. So this one was written with him in mind, and as you can see, Things like get a plate and get a knife are separate items. Those are maybe things that some learners could get together, but for him, getting the tools needed as well as the ingredients individually, one at a time, makes a lot more sense for his motor planning. And then there's individual steps written about things like twist the bread bag closed and affix the twist tie, because that particular step might be a little tricky for Jace, and we might need to consider how we're going to help him to do that independently with some different prompting or different ways that we might go about teaching that. So this is a very in-depth task analysis where everything's written out pretty discreetly as individual steps, really considering the motor planning and fine motor needs of a learner. While this is a sample task analysis for making a turkey sandwich, the exact same thing as the previous slide, except this one was written with Tyler in mind. If you remember Tyler, he does not have those same motor planning needs that Jace has. And so he was the task analysis that we were able to write for Tyler, looks a little bit different. As you can see, Jace's on the previous page was 28 steps. This one's 17 steps. Tyler is able to get the plate and the knife at the same time. He's able to get all of the ingredients from the refrigerator at the same time and take them to the counter. And we didn't need individual steps for dipping the knife into the mayonnaise and spreading it onto the bread because Tyler's able to sequence those things and he can motor plan them. So he's not going to require the same prompting level that maybe Jace would. So that's why this one is a little bit different. I can tell you that this task analysis was originally only 15 steps, but Mom had a little something to say about Tyler's cleanliness when doing this activity of making himself a sandwich. He put everything away because those were things that were on the task analysis that he had been taught to do. And he would go to the table and eat his sandwich, and then he would even take his plate and put it in the sink because that is something that he had learned to do for other meals. But what he hadn't learned and what wasn't written into this at first was steps 14 and 15. So what he was doing was after he would spread the mayonnaise, he'd leave the knife on the counter for a minute so there was a smear of mayonnaise on the counter, and when he took the bread out of the bag, there were some crumbs that ended up on the counter. And so Mom was saying, yeah, he can make a sandwich, he eats it, he does his lunch independently now, which is fantastic. But I gotta say, the kitchen's kind of messy afterward. And I'm finding myself, walking around cleaning up after him still. So we said, easy fix. Let's add some steps into his task analysis where he learns that before he can eat the food, after he's put the ingredients away, he needs to also get a towel and wet it and wipe off the counter and throw that paper towel out. Then he can go and sit down and eat. So these things can be moving targets. It's okay if you don't get every step exactly correctly the first time. You can add in more steps later. We want to try and be as explicit as possible from the beginning so that we're not constantly changing the rules on our learners. But if we find later down the road that, it would really be great if this routine or this task included this other step, you can go ahead and add that in. So that is something that I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention. And like I said, in the supplementary materials, there's more examples of task analyses. So how do I go about teaching a task analysis? How do I teach a task using a task analysis? There's two ways to present a task that we've found to be the most efficacious with this group of learners, with kind of our high functioning autism spectrum disorder teens, is we see that total task presentation and forward chaining are two really good ways to present a task analysis. And this would be a total task presentation is when you teach the entire skill sequence. Maybe you model it first, you teach it all together at the same time. And the benefit for teaching the entire thing is that the individual learns the entire routine without any interruptions. And that's one really good way to do it. Another way to do it is forward chaining. And in forward chaining, you teach one step at a time, beginning with the very first step. And once they master a step, then you move on to the next one. And one reason that you might do that is if there's too many steps that are overwhelming, particularly when you're going to chain some tasks. You might want to teach each of the tasks individually first, and then teach them how to do them sequentially back to back to back. So in a morning routine, you want to make sure that they know how to brush their teeth before you're asking them to brush their teeth, put on deodorant, apply face lotion, and comb their hair all while they're still standing at the sink right after a shower. So forward chaining and total task presentation are two ways to teach tasks using task analysis. So let's go ahead and look at two videos of this happening. This first one, we chose tasks that most kids at this point, most teens at this point probably know how to do, and that is hand washing, because we're not really focusing on what the actual skill that's being taught, but we're focusing on the strategies of how they're being taught. So let's watch how Tyler learns to wash his hands.
Here's a task analysis that we've written for Tyler to learn all of the correct steps of hand washing. As you can see, I've reminded myself at the top that he's going to always have access to a visual schedule, that he's been taught using the total task presentation, and that we're using a least to most prompting strategy. In all, he should complete 11 steps. His visual schedule, on the other hand, only will have 5 steps, the most salient features of this task for Tyler. Tyler, can you wash your hands?
Great. So now let's go ahead and watch.
Here's a task analysis.
Now let's go ahead and watch Jace learning the same skill, but in a little bit of a different way.
Here is the task analysis for Jace to learn all of the steps of washing hands. As you'll remember, Jace has some issues surrounding motor planning and fine motor. So his task analysis looks a little different than Tyler's. This task analysis has more steps in that we needed to teach Jace all of the different parts of his hands that needed to be scrubbed. And we also needed to teach him to use 2 hands to do things like grip the handle on the faucet to turn it on. So he is also going to have a visual schedule, but he's being taught using forward chaining. The star on line 8 indicates to me, the teacher, that that is currently the level to which he has learned and is independent up until that star, and I will need to help him with most to least prompting, physical hand-over-hand prompting from line 8, step 8, all the way through to the end of this task analysis. So let's help Jace learn how to correctly wash his hands. Jace, can you start washing your hands?
As you can see from those two videos, we're trying to show you the different ways that a task analysis could be individualized for a learner, that the steps will be different depending on what your teen's strengths profile looks like, what your teen likes doing. Obviously, if your teen doesn't eat a turkey sandwich, you're never going to write a turkey sandwich task analysis. But there are some things that are universal. Obviously, everyone needs how to learn how to wash their hands. So there are some tasks that everyone will learn, and there's other tasks that you'll write depending on the needs of your family, of your teen, and you will write those steps based on the way in which your learner needs to be supported and your teen needs to learn them. So to just recap really quickly about a task analysis, first you choose a task, make sure it's something with a definitive start and end. Then you're going to write down the steps. You can do that as you do the task, or you watch another adult do the task, or your teen could write it down while you do the task. Then you're going to check those steps, make sure that it's correct, try and follow them, have somebody else try to follow them. Then write it up on a final piece of paper and prepare any materials. Think about the way in which you're going to teach. Are you going to teach all of the steps at once? Are you going to support certain steps right from the start? We're going to get into prompting in just a minute, and so that will help you decide the way in which you're going to teach. Are you going to have a visual schedule or visual cues available? Are there specific materials that your teen is going to need to execute the task? Gather all those things, make those things, draw those things, and have it all ready to go. And then it's time to start teaching. And in order to teach, you're probably going to need some sort of a prompting strategy so that your teen can gain the skills that they don't know yet, or that they've never tried yet, or they've never executed. And then you're going to want to have a plan for prompting, for fading those prompts as necessary. So to get into all of that, my colleague Kiera Peak will discuss prompting with you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. This is Kiara again, coming to talk to you about prompting. First, what is prompting? Prompting is any kind of assistance that you are going to give your teen as you guys are working towards these daily living skills. So whether it is a visual cue that you've placed for them or a verbal instruction, any gesture, added instruction to help your teen complete a task correctly is a form of prompting. And there are many different types of prompting. First we have here is a full physical, otherwise known as hand-over-hand prompting, where you are placing your hand over your teen's body to kind of help them complete the task correctly. And there's also partial physical, where maybe it's not directly hand over hand, but you are using some partial physical touch to kind of lead your teen's body to complete a task correctly. We also have modeling, which is mainly just demonstrating how to do a step or part of a task, and your teen watches. And then there are some other things known as gestural prompts, where you're either pointing or nodding or giving subtle cues to kind of help your teen complete a task successfully. We also have verbal prompts, which is verbally communicating to the teen what to do next. And then visual prompts are more visual aids that are placed in front of your teen or in the area where they'll be working on this task, kind of remind them of the next step of what to do. So it could be, a Post-it note on your mirror to remind you to, put on deodorant, or it could be a picture you drew or a picture taken, anything visual to kind of help your teen along. And we wanted to point out that there is a prompting hierarchy. So the way the prompts were listed out on the previous slide go from most to least, where you're starting with full physical to a visual prompt. So that takes the most amount of intrusivity to complete a task on your part as the caregiver for the teen. And going from the other side of this chart here, visual to full physical, is least to most prompting. And we wanted to reiterate that, depending on where your teen is with these skills, they could require different prompts for working on these skills. I also wanted to touch on that a lot of times we think that, a verbal prompt is, the least amount of guidance we can give or prompting we can give for our teen to complete a task, when actually it's a visual prompt. For instance, I use visual prompts myself. I like to keep my phone near my keys, especially at the end of the day, so that when I'm in a rush trying to get out the door, I know that they're together, and that helps me remember where they are. And if I forget to place my phone near my keys, then I'm wasting an extra 5 to 10 minutes just to find it, kind of making me a little bit late out the door. And so visual prompts are very helpful for all of us, and they're actually very much helpful and the least intrusive because it's something that you guys could have in place when you're not there. So with a verbal prompt, you have to be there to kind of give the verbal prompt, right? But with a visual prompt, it's something that you could leave behind to help your teen remember a next step in getting ready. For instance, if your teen is having trouble kind of remembering to put on deodorant, maybe placing the deodorant next to their clothes for the next day will kind of help them remember, yes, this is an extra step I need to remember to do that I really don't want to forget. And so we wanted to point out that, yes, there is a hierarchy, and yes, a visual aid is very helpful for a teen and helpful for you as a caregiver, as you won't need to be there. But as you kind of work and see what prompting would be best for your teen, as we fade through kind of, let's say you start off with a partial physical and you kind of fade through and go down to the more least prompting prompts. Even if you land at a visual prompt, that's fantastic because that is a prompt that is not, or that is a prompt that does not require you to be in the room, but hopefully that helps them remember certain steps within a task. Prompt selection. So you've decided what skills you're going to work on with your teen, and you may notice along this path that there's some other issues that come up, whether maybe there's some motor planning issues, emotion regulation issues, sensory regulation issues, and where to get started on these prompts. And so here are some tips to kind of help you with where to get started. Of course, every teen is going to be different, but we emphasize that, we try out a strategy with your teen for a bit of a while, maybe a week or two, and see how they respond with that particular prompt before adjusting it. It may take some time for your teen to get acclimated to certain things. But if you do notice that they are having some issues with motor planning, maybe they would benefit from more physical types of prompts and then kind of fading from more full to partial and so on over time. If they're struggling with some executive functioning, remembering a sequence, they might benefit from having some visual prompts that kind of show each step in front of them, or to go up more on the prompting hierarchy, more verbal or gestural prompts. With emotional regulation, they might get frustrated with some steps. It may be helpful to have some visual aids, or if they get very easily frustrated with that, maybe more guidance to kind of help along with that in the beginning before fading to different phases of the prompting hierarchy. With sensory regulation, it really depends on the sensory needs of your teen. So low arousal may benefit from more physical prompts, and while high arousal teens may benefit from verbal or visual prompts. So it's really going to depend, and it's really going to depend on, you trying out different methods for a while to see what works best for your teen. So revisiting Tyler and Jace, the hand washing videos that you saw earlier, I just wanted to point out how the differences between the two, right? And so I'll click on Tyler's video.
Tyler, can you wash your hands?
So we see him washing his hands. And the caregiver points to the visual aid to remind Tyler that, yes, 20 seconds is needed to complete this hand washing task. So it did include a gesture in here as well. But notice how they didn't say, look at the visual aid. They just made a gesture to the visual aid. It's more so taking the least and most approach and helping Tyler with his hand washing skill. Now with Jace, we take more of a most to least prompting here.
Jace, can you start washing your hands?
And so Jace is able to turn on the faucet or the water in the faucet and clean his hands a little bit, goes to turn off the water, able to get some soap out, starts scrubbing on his own. Doing well so far. It seems to be more hung up on cleaning certain sections. And so here we have more kind of hand-on-hand assistance to clean the rest of his hands thoroughly. And so more of a hands-on approach here with Jace to kind of help him completely clean his hands within the appropriate amount of time and appropriate cleaning strategies. It's just interesting to see these two videos side by side. So just a reminder that teens are going to be different and may require more guidance or less guidance. But to really keep in mind that there are many different strategies and many different issues that teens will need to work on, and that's okay. And so another thing we wanted to mention is that we know it is very hard to change up our habits with our teens, right? And so when working on these new skills with our teen, it's very important that we don't jump in immediately ready to help. These are skills that we want our teen to develop, and we want to give them time to process what to do next. And so we recommend that when working on these skills to count to 5 seconds. And now counting to 5 seconds feels like a long time. I'm going to go ahead and count. You guys can count with me and you'll see how long it feels. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. That is how long we're asking you to give your teen as they work through a task. Now, this is not just for the beginning of a task before you jump in. After 5 seconds, please go in with your next cue and help them along to do a task correctly. But once you help a little bit, step back again, maybe depending on where you are with your prompting hierarchy that you are using with your teen, and give them 5 seconds again to figure out the next step. Your teen may actually surprise you. We just need to give them a bit more time. Practice makes progress. We understand that working towards these skills is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of opportunities for your teen to practice so that these steps become routine. And it's going to take repetition, repetition, repetition. So just working on this every now and then is going to help carry over the skills that your teens need to learn. It's very important that you create opportunities to work with these steps with your teen fairly regularly. And we encourage you to be patient, be positive, and be understanding. These are difficult skills we all have to learn, and it's going to take all of us a bit more time to kind of let go of those old habits we had before to work on these habits that are going to help your teen be successful. Thank you so much for completing Module 2 of the It's Not Just Chores web series. We greatly appreciate your participation and hope you found this information helpful.